for tuning in for the Scholar Spotlight, and please be sure to let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. My name is Brad Fulton, and I'm the director of the Faith and Prejudice Institute, which is part of the larger Faith and Prejudice movement. Faith and Prejudice is committed to equipping and convening and mobilizing churches to build bridges to racial equity. And at the Institute, we focus on curating and disseminating research on race and religion. And part of the Institute's focus is bringing on scholars who are doing research in this space. And today, we're having Professor Helen Kim join us. And Professor Kim earned her PhD in religion as well as a Master's of Divinity from Harvard University. And she did her undergraduate work at Stanford University. She's currently a professor of American Religious History at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And she is a recipient of the Young Scholar in American Religion Award. Professor Kim is an expert on U.S. religion and history with a particular focus on Asian American religions. Today we'll be discussing her newest book, Race for Revival, how Cold War South Korea shaped the American evangelical empire. Thank you, Professor Kim, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Brad, and I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to chat with you all.
Wonderful. Well, I'm very excited to start talking about your book, but before we do, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up becoming a professor who studies race and religion?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So, as I was, mentioning to you, I did college out in Northern California. I went to Stanford, and there I actually wanted to be an English literature major, but then changed my major to comparative studies in race and ethnicity. And then I ended up doing both. So I double majored, but I kind of the CSRE or comparative studies in race and ethnicity became kind of my central major. And that's how I got started in all of this. I had questions about race and religion that just started to emerge as an undergrad, especially by even kind of witnessing racial inequity kind of on the ground through service learning projects that I was experiencing even in kind of my undergrad days. That culminated in an honors thesis about race and religion, focused especially on Japanese American Christians. Yeah.
And so, in what ways does your faith influence your research on race and religion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually, in those days when I was starting to develop my undergraduate thesis, I had a lot of questions about the kind of theological options that were available to Korean Americans like myself, who lived in kind of this diasporic context or immigrant context, and myself being a second generation Korean American. My parents immigrated here, but we also lived very transnationally because my father also lived in South Korea for a long time. And I just noticed that in the Korean American diaspora, most of us were exposed to evangelical theology. That was the primary kind of theological impulse that kind of was undergirding our immigrant communities as well as second generation communities. So we had a lot of questions about evangelicalism and its ties to larger movements like politics, like the Christian right, etc. But I also was aware that my family, in Korea had been tied to other kind of theological expressions, like the Korean kind of indigenous form of liberation theology called Minjung theology, theology of the people. Also, my own mother, being really informed by Asian feminist theologies. And so I just started to ask questions about my own context and how did we become so exposed to certain types of theologies and less so to others. So this is kind of the context out of which I began to ask a lot of different questions about religion.
Yeah, I mean that's super helpful to know, because I know when I read your book, one of the major theses or contributions of your book is most of the the history of evangelicalism in the U.S. looks at a transatlantic progression, like so from
Mhm.
Europe to the U.S. But your book takes a completely different approach by looking at the Pan-Pacific
Mhm.
progression of evangelicalism
Mhm.
and its relationship with Asia and in particular South
Mhm.
Korea. So it's kind of neat to hear more of the backstory. And I'd say contributing to that, like what inspired you to write this book at this
Mhm.
time? Can you expand even more on that?
Yeah, there's so many different ways to answer that question. But I think it was just these ongoing questions about how did evangelicalism come to predominate in Korean America, the Korean diaspora, even in South Korea, and what relationship, if at all, did it have to do with kind of mainstream evangelicalism in America, including kind of white led evangelical institutions like Campus Crusade for Christ, like World Vision, like the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. I really actually began looking at those linkages by looking at Campus Crusade for Christ, just because I noticed a lot of my friends and a lot of other Korean Americans, Asian Americans were part of Campus Crusade. And I found out that its first kind of international partner, its first non white partner, was with a South Korean. And then I just started pulling the threads from there, following the kind of archival trail, and just noticed that not only Campus Crusade, but World Vision had this really tight knit relationship with Korea. So did the BGEA
Hmm.
and so many other organizations, actually. But those are the three main that I studied, and it just happened because I followed these archival trails that tightly intertwine Korea with American evangelicalism.
Sure. Well,
Mhm.
and so why? I mean, I think that's extremely insightful and a strong finding in and of itself.
Mhm.
Why is South Korea such a critical nation in the development of modern American evangelicalism? Like, why South Korea compared to other Asian nations?
Yeah, I think that was one of my driving questions.
Hmm.
I was profoundly perplexed actually by that because, as Protestantism in general, isn't actually a major tradition in a lot of Asian countries. I spent a whole summer in Thailand, for instance. I mean, Christianity is such a small percentage of Thailand. It's a primarily Buddhist nation. Or even like China or even Japan, where Japan, Christianity has never been more than 1% of modern Japan. So even though so many missionaries have attempted to kind of expand the Christian presence, so I found this this reality that South Korea, the percentage of Christianity went from less than 5% in 1950 to almost 20% of the country by 1980, within three decades, to be really alarming, interesting, perplexing. And I read a lot of what other scholars had been saying, and I just thought that they studied it mostly kind of in a nation bound framework, kind of South Korea unto itself or America unto itself, but I really wanted to study kind of the transnational connections. Um, and to answer your question directly, why South Korea is, and as I talk about in the book, it has to do with the Korean War.
Hmm.
So, just the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 became this major world event that not only further reinstantiated kind of the division between North and South Korea, but also led to a significant presence, kind of a unprecedented American presence in Korea, unknown to Korea's history prior to that, and that also was this key kind of military kind of foundation for America's presence in the Cold War in Asia. Yeah, so those routes, it's really kind of the story of war, that helps us to unpack why South Korea.
And so does this tie into, like, I've been curious about the story behind your title of your book, or at
Mhm,
least the
mhm.
first part, Race for Revival. Um, what's the story behind it, and is it tied into this overarching thesis?
Yeah, so that's a title. That's probably if I look back at my drafts, I probably have 50 other titles that I developed from, over the course of like 10 years or something like that. And really, that title came to me the last year of my edits.
Wow.
Yeah, just as everything was just kind of
Hmm.
coming together and I was editing, re-editing, and it came together, and it's really tied to kind of this last sentence of the book, which is I can just go ahead and read it because it is very much tied, kind of underscores the meaning of the title itself, which is revival is not a race, and one race does not have a monopoly on revival. And it kind of is pointing to two things that are really highlighted in the book, which is that I have this whole theme about how this transnational interaction between Korean and Korean and American evangelicals is a racialized narrative. And there are a lot of tensions around who owns revival.
Hmm.
And what is it? Is it Billy Graham who owns
Hmm.
the revival that's
Hmm.
the largest revival he's ever had in South Korea, which was in South Korea in 1970?
Wow.
Or do the Koreans own that revival because they populated it with 1.1 million people? I mean,
Wow.
who
Yeah.
owns who? And then there's this whole racialized aspect to religious revival, but also it as I show, there's a sense of competition too between the two countries when it comes to, especially the South Koreans, thinking about religion as a way for them to advance their nation. Yeah. Of these large revivalistic moments as a way to show and sometimes even outpace kind of the evangelical scale of American Protestants. As a way for them to show on the global stage their um, kind of their presence on the global stage.
Yeah. Well, so one of the themes in the book that I, identified or saw was that when it's a two-part question. So,
Mm.
what are the ways in which the U.S. used South Korean Protestants?
Mhm.
And then also, how did the South Koreans use American evangelicalism?
Yeah,
So, two parts, but how would you respond to those?
yeah. I think that's a great question. It really does get to the heart of a lot of kind of the themes and the tensions that are kind of folded throughout the book and get looked at from all these different angles, chapter by chapter. But just the first part of the question, how do American evangelicals use South Korea? So the first chapter in and of itself is this challenging chapter, I think, because I talk about kind of the Korean foundations of World Vision, one of the largest evangelical humanitarian organizations in the world, and many people have written about World Vision and its connection to Korea. But I'm also talking about not only the fact that Korea, you know, World Vision was founded not only by Bob Pierce, but also Kyung-Jik Han, who's a Korean Presbyterian. And I also detail the evidence that shows that like Han gave Pierce the idea to create World Vision, which is kind of like a weird thing to think about because World Vision seems so much today in America as even in Korea too, but as having been led by Pierce. Um, so there's that story, but the part about kind of the misuse of that narrative is like Joe is why don't we know that story?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And for me, it does have to do with the racialization of South Koreans in
Mm-hmm.
the kind of white evangelical imagination, and also how that story gets remembered. It gets misremembered. It
Hmm.
gets misremembered through other sources that detail the history of World Vision, also even documentaries that Bob Pierce produces, as I show you kind of the racial erasure of Koreans from that kind of founding narrative. And so, I think in that way, you really see the growth of an organization like World Vision that's happening because of Koreans at the same time, you see, unfortunately, their erasure from that narrative too. And it does have to do with like a racial erasure, as I argue. Mhm. So there's that piece. And then, of course, Koreans also have their own responses to these dynamics. And somebody like Han is very invested in not only Korean Christianity and its growth, but in Korean nationalism. Coming out of the rule of Japanese Empire, right? With
Mm-hmm.
the end of the
Mm-hmm.
Pacific Wars, Korean Christians are very much interested in nation building, and now with the U.S. militarization of South Korea, they're thinking about how do we use Christianity to build the nation. And one of the ways that they channel that energy is by hosting massive crusades. And Han is at the helm of this. So are figures like Billy Jong-hoon Kim. So are figures like Jung-gun Kim, who are all associated with either World Vision, the BGEA, or Campus Crusade for Christ. And how they're using American evangelicals in this context is, I think, exemplified by someone like Billy Kim, who at Billy Graham's largest crusade in 1973 in Seoul he's translating for Graham at this crusade. And it's as if Graham is in the spotlight, but he really thinks of it as a moment for him to be in the spotlight. This crusade is actually centered on me and what I'm translating in Korean to the Korean people. And
Mm-hmm.
this is now a moment to kind of center my own
Hmm.
um, presence as a pastor, my
Yeah.
own vision of what I think Korean Christianity should be. And so these crusades are moments for these kind of male Korean Protestant pastors to highlight kind of their spiritual prowess, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, this is your book is such a great contribution in that most of the stuff that we hear about Asian American Christians or Korean American Christians, it ends at the borders of the oceans, and we don't really go further on to um, like South Korea and look at the dynamics that are playing out in real time as these things were playing out in the U.S. In what ways did these dynamics of sort of the emergence of evangelicalism in Korea foreshadow like the rise of the Christian right in the U.S. and even in South Korea in the 1980s? Like, how does that play together? If we start off in the 50s with the Korean War and then accelerate to the 80s, how is this sort of playing out?
Yeah. So I have a couple of things I want to say about this. This is, I mean, first, just because you mentioned like Korean American, Asian American history, or specifically religious history, often is kind of nation bound. But I really wanted to tell the transnational story because I just didn't think you could understand fully kind of 20th and 21st century Asian American Christian context without these connections.
Mm-hmm.
And what you see is that these massive crusades that are gathering 1.1 million people and sometimes even more in South Korea become this occasion for these Korean Protestant ministers to show their kind of theological presence and to make themselves known on the global stage of world Christianity at the same time that their theology, by the time you get to chapter 5 and the conclusion of my book, I suggest that the theology that they advance, especially one that 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 gets mired in the politics of South Korean authoritarianism under the Park Chung-hee era, that is part of what then gets full that kind of undermines some of their nationalistic aims, right? To really advance kind of Korean Christianity and the Korean nation forward. That's a desire they have on the one hand. On the other hand, their theological apparatus doesn't have the kind of political potential and the political power to really critique the political context they're living in, is under South Korean authoritarianism. And that kind of South Korean authoritarian context has deep connections to American political conservatism.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so there's this kind of undermining process that happens through these transactional networks, even as they're using them to kind of show their power on this global stage. The kind of political theology that's undergirding these transnational networks, I argue, don't have the power to really make the critiques against political authoritarianism or against its attachments to American conservatism. Therefore, they get folded into these politics. So unfortunately, you see how, you know, Jung Kim, who's in Campus Crusade for Christ, he's very closely aligning with the Park regime, and its authoritarian politics, which um, is very closely tied with Nixon, and and you know lead up to then the rise of Reagan. Because I'm showing you how an organization like Campus Crusade for Christ nurtures these kinds of not only kind of the spirituality, but also kind of the politics of conservatism through these transnational networks. It's
Hmm.
not just happening domestically, is what I showed you.
Mhm, mhm,
It's
mhm.
happening through a transnational process, including connections to Korea.
Yeah. Well, so then if we bring it to the contemporary moment, you mentioned Korea Campus Crusade for Christ, and I've met missionaries from Korea who have been sent over to the U.S. They're with Korea Campus Crusade for Christ, and they're being sent to the U.S. as missionaries. And how would you characterize South Korea's relationship with American evangelicalism today?
Yeah. Yeah, South Koreans as well as the Korean diaspora in the US. I mean, I'll say it this way. I think it's kind of a both and story, which
Hmm.
is that on the one hand, as it relates to especially to politics, I think on the one hand, you see this ongoing trend of Korean Protestants with kind of evangelical leanings that continue to get folded into kind of conservative politics, whether it's in the US or in South Korea. Um, and you can actually see that getting mapped onto even voting behavior, right? So Korean Americans who are voting for the right, both in America as well as in South Korea. On the other hand, you do see this whole other narrative of, at least in terms of political behavior in Korea and America, Korean Americans who also are voting blue, right? Voting for Democrats, who are, especially when it comes to immigration, right? When it comes to race, they feel their racial alienation and they're voting out of that sense of alienation in their politics. So you have a both and story. And I think that's also reflected in no, Janelle Wong's book on Asian American evangelicals and their voting behavior, is that they're kind of both and neither party has fully captured the Asian American evangelical vote.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
But I think that you see in my story an explanation for the ongoing politically conservative trends in Korean America as well as in South Korea.
Uh-huh. So there's also a conservative bias amongst evangelicals in Korea as well.
So that story I think is variegated, right? Depending on the type of evangelical Protestant in South Korea, you can have a wide political span. So it's not just one, right, kind of political avenue that they're moving toward, but you do see some of the most kind of extreme right politics in Korea, even today. You do see connections to some evangelical Protestant preachers, right, who are engaged in kind of these very divisive politics, um, including, and my colleague at Ewha University, Myung-Sam Seo, studies this. He talks about a culture wars that South Korean evangelical Protestant preachers are also part of, especially in terms of their kind of anti-homosexuality politics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because really advancing some of those sexual politics by using evangelical Protestantism as a way to argue for it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, like thinking about just Christians in the U.S. Or more broadly, why is it important for people to understand American evangelicalism through an Asian American frame?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on, right, about this question alone.
Yeah.
One, I don't think you could understand even the very founding of some of these American evangelical institutions unless you start studying kind
Wow.
of Asian American contributions to them. I,
Mm-hmm.
some of them wouldn't have existed.
Mm.
First, for example, World Vision wouldn't have existed without the Korean presence. Campus Crusade would have never expanded in the way that it did globally without the Korean presence. Billy Graham would have never had his largest crusade ever, right? With kind of Korean connection. So I don't think that just the nuts and bolts of some of these organizations would make sense without understanding how Koreans or Asians got absorbed into them or how they also chose to participate in them. One. Two is I think also it's really hard to understand the racial politics of American evangelical organizations without understanding Asian and Asian American presence.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is we have to think about why Asian Americans have been part of these organizations, what they found appealing about American evangelicalism, but
Mm.
also, as I show in my book, how they're especially pitted against how kind of ideologies of white supremacy are functioning in modern American evangelical institutions by pitting Asian Americans against African Americans. Kind of the anti-black politics that undergird some of these institutions are happening because Asian Americans are being pitted against African Americans. I don't think you can understand that just by looking at African Americans and kind of white evangelical dynamics alone. We have to also think about how Asian Americans are being triangulated into that process. And for me, it happens domestically. It's also happening through the dynamics of war. They kind of bring Koreans into kind of the racial frame American evangelicalism. A lot of anti-blackness gets propped up by white evangelicals in the late 20th century by this idea of propping up Asian Americans, people of Asian descent, as the quote unquote model minority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we can fully understand how white supremacy gets nurtured in these American evangelical institutions without understanding this racial triangulation process.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, how to dismantle it. Look, it's going to require dismantling the whole frame, not just one frame, you know? So I think we have to pay attention to Asian and Asian American populations, both how they're choosing to be part of these organizations, also how they're being used by these organizations, how there are other racialized structures that are pitting them against other groups. All of this must be studied for us to really understand both kind of the religious and racial dynamics of American evangelicalism.
Yeah, and I think that's where your book makes a major contribution because your starting point is South Korea, and then looking at its progression and interaction with American evangelicalism. And I think this conversation only scratches the surface. But if any of you viewers who are piqued of interest about this topic, I highly recommend getting Professor Kim's book. We're going to put a link in the comments for how you can get that. We'll also put a link to Professor Kim's website, faculty webpage, where you can learn more about the other aspects of her research. And Professor Kim, I really appreciate you, first of all, writing the book. I mean, that is a labor of love, and I knew it took multiple years and multiple drafts. So I appreciate you doing that and even talking with us today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone else who joined us. Please enter questions in the comments and we'll get back to you. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Scholar Spotlight. Thank you.